capture the climate-related inequalities. And this is the reason why with Werner from Stats and with Murray, we've proposed this panel in trying to see, okay, given the crowd of experts that we have here on both issues, how can we think together of making these tools a bit more responsive to the current challenges? With regards to climate change, there are various reporting and monitoring systems that are in place from the NDCs, what has been mentioned also in the Paris Agreement and the IPCC reports. And we're very lucky to have in the panel both Samuel from the DFFE and Andrew that could take us through a little bit with the data that is there around climate change and how we can then link it to inequality. So, on the panel, we have Murray Leibbrandt and Andrew Marquard, who are both professors at UCT. We have Werner Ruch from Stats, who is the director for Monometric Poverty and Inequality Statistics. And we have Samuel from the DFFE, who's deputy director for Climate Change Monitoring and Evaluation. We're going to start with Murray, who can tell us a bit more about what these inequality diagnostics are and how we came to this project. And then we're going to move to some questions. Thanks.
Great. Good morning, everybody. When ACEIR was established in 2018, when it was funded as one of the ARUA Centers of Excellence, one of our founding challenges really was this is an African Center of Excellence for Inequality Research with some very strong African researchers who'd been very prominent in the discussion around poverty and poverty alleviation around the continent, and also in the discussion of inequalities that were being deemed to be so important. And the way we'd proceeded with our work, and I'm talking about the ACEIR team now across the continent, was to use the available data in our respective countries and across the continent to bring value, to bring analysis and value into the discussions of poverty and inequality in our country context. That was what our work was about, and we enjoyed a very close working relationship with our national statistical officers in our countries, and so that was our particular strength of our research, and so from the outset, we were looking to the inequality discussion was far less well developed than the poverty discussion. And in some senses, at the founding of ACEIR, it was a moment like this. It was exactly a moment like this, but now we're talking about the intersections of inequality and climate change. But we were trying to think through a way of providing a platform for analysis, for sure, but a platform to allow us to bring some value to the public engagement around inequalities in each African context, and in both the analysis and the measurement, but also to make more broadly available and accessible to people to engage in these discussions. It was really Anders' genius, actually, in configuring this notion of producing inequality diagnostics in any country as a partnership with the national statistical officers, if at all possible, and with the broader society, even in the conceptualization and design. And so the origins of these diagnostics was with our strength to be able to do this, because there's a lot of hard work to be done. If you want to make these contributions, you've got to be willing to roll up your sleeves and deliver a diagnostic that both profiles the country context or the continent or whatever as a platform for engagement, but also is very clear about the data that's used and the quality of the data and whether it's available. So it's a resource. It's a real resource, and it takes a lot of hard work. And we wrote a handbook on the analysis on how these diagnostics were produced, or how you do quantitative analysis of multidimensional inequality to accompany this, and then enjoyed this extraordinary working relationship with the NSOs. In producing these diagnostics, but then once they were produced, then of course, so some of the diagnostics are released actually as official statistical releases. The first inequality reports in a number of African contexts. There's regular poverty reports once every 5 years or once every whatever. Most African countries produce a poverty report. But the stats officers were also incredibly open to then engaging over these diagnostics and with stakeholder events and a broader discussion. So the statistical officers were very comfortable talking to, well, what's in these diagnostics? What do they say? And then the basis for the engagement is, well, as we've seen already in the first session today, many people have a range of opinions about what that means and what that means about going forward. And so the engagements that followed the release of the diagnostics were the broadening of the partnership. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marie. So now we're turning to you, because you were with us, the first partner to do an inequality diagnostic. So this comprehensive report of everything there is to know about multidimensional inequalities. Well, now we realize that we didn't add climate as a dimension, but still, before thinking about what future diagnostics should look like, can you tell us maybe how this report was used, if they had any impact, be it in the policy sphere or in your everyday today work at the National Statistical Office? What was interesting, what was less? Thanks.
Thank you, Anda. Yes, so I think let me begin by echoing some of Marie's points. I think at StatsA, even poverty and inequality, it took a while for those issues to really cement their place within the organization. You would imagine South Africa being a country, emerged out of the apartheid state, inherent inequalities, inherent high levels of poverty. But at the stats agency itself, it was never truly, it was hard to pin down. I think in the early 2000s, a lot of the work went around just trying to develop poverty lines and other money metric tools that could be used. And that slowly evolved into what finally became the household budget statistics section, which then evolved into poverty and inequality stats. And when it really took off, poverty was the dominant force that was part of the discussion. It's what everyone wanted to talk about, and inequality was a secondary subject. It was the ugly stepchild. You would have your beautiful poverty report, and you have a little section about inequality. And so the two were never really on equal footing. And it was really in 2014 that StatsA put together what we called the Poverty Trends Report, which was this first very comprehensive report that looked at the multidimensional nature of poverty, whether it be the money metric side, which is where my specialty lies, but also on the multidimensional side as well as the subjective side, and trying to bring all these pieces together and see how they interact with one another. And as time went on, we had published a second poverty trends report, and that's when really between Murray and Anda from AFD and ACEIR in its formation was saying, how can StatsA come and partner with ACEIR? And that's where this inequality diagnostic was born. And it was quite an exciting process because it was the first time we could actually put inequality in its own space and treat it as an equal to poverty. So it was a tremendous platform, and I think it has been very, very well received. We published it in 2019. It's unfortunate because I remember we published it in November 2019. It was here in Cape Town, and we had quite a robust program of wanting all the things we wanted to do with it as it was rolling out. And of course, the pandemic hits, and it changes that calculus. But even without the more robust dissemination strategy that we wanted to put in place, this inequality trends reports, the ITR as we call it internally, it really has become a very foundational document. I think one of the key benefits is when we approached it, we rooted it in actual frameworks that existed. So we looked at the National Development Plan, South Africa's overarching developmental policy framework. And there, the top two objectives, one's on poverty, the other's on inequality. The one on inequality is saying, let's reduce the Gini to 0.6 by 2030. So we really looked at these frameworks, whether it be the NDP or the medium-term strategic framework, and then even international and continental ones, sort of from the AU and also from the UN with the SDGs. And we said, what are the inequality dimensions that we see in these frameworks, and how can we translate those and bring them into the inequality trends report? And so beyond it being then this very robust tool, as Murray describes it, what it did was, it provided policymakers and government the information on the indicators that they said they wanted information on. So there we tick that box. But at the same time, we introduced a range of new indicators that had never been in the South African discourse, whether they be some of these economic ones like the Palmer ratio or some of the other ones, or going into to gender and whatnot. So we really brought new it was a catalyst for new discussions and new indicators that the government had not really thought of, that are now becoming mainstream in these discussions. So I think it's been well received in government. It is being applied, it is being used, and increasingly we see researchers who also want to engage with it, but as Under pointed out, that there's still more to be done. I think that there's still gaps in there, that even though we took what we think was a very wide multidimensional approach, we can just see how many more angles we could have still potentially took.
Thank you so much. So these types of diagnostics, we've also done them in Kenya with the KNBS. Unfortunately, we won't be able to talk about it, but we can definitely send you the links to the other ones. And we're currently doing others in Africa and Mozambique and Mali, but also outside Africa, because there was a huge interest from the different statistical offices to engage in this exercise with us. So we've just finalized one in Colombia. We're doing one in Indonesia, again with ACEIR. And it's, for us, at least in Nairobi, it's also interesting to be able to have African partners working with other international ones, like Asian ones, and supporting them in building these types of approaches and of reports. Now, Werner mentioned the frameworks that we've worked around with regards to inequality. When it comes to climate, we know that, for instance, the Paris Agreement is one of the most important ones. I'm not saying that because I'm French, but I would like to hear more from Andrew on how does the reporting of climate action actually works in support of the Paris Agreement, for instance.
Does that work? Yeah, it's working. Yeah. Thanks. There is a so from the point of view of the multilateral system that has been built around climate change, there's obviously a level of abstraction from national data to the data that we report internationally, et cetera, et cetera. But what is important is that the international process that has been elaborated for this comes with quite a lot of resources. And so there are advantages in trying to find synergies between our international reporting and our national reporting and data gathering processes. And for all of this, the institutional context is very important. The Paris Agreement requires countries to report in a kind of set of concentric circles. So the middle of the circle are the things that countries have to include in their reports, and those are two elements really for developing countries. The first one is a detailed greenhouse gas inventory, which is obviously the basis for addressing climate change mitigation. And the data structures that underlie that detailed greenhouse gas inventory are involved in a whole lot of other sectors. So in other words, the energy data that goes into estimating greenhouse gases is built on an energy data infrastructure that has to exist outside of that process, which produces things like energy balances, et cetera, et cetera. And if you don't have that in your system, then you can't accurately estimate emissions. So in a sense, the data that we report to the UNFCCC is the tip of an iceberg, and underneath that, there's a whole data infrastructure. There are some advantages to the whole UNFCCC structure around reporting over purely national arrangements. So one of these is that the data is reviewed in a facilitative way by a panel of experts drawn from other countries, and so there's a large degree of both. First of all, for us, this process is free, so it's a way of having a bunch of experts spend a week going through all of the information that we've reported and making useful comments on it. And secondly, the review process relates to a specific set of practices and a specific set of guidelines. And this has actually driven the improvement of international climate change data that is available from nation states in two different ways. The first one is that it's driven the development and improvement of national institutions, and the second one is that there's this kind of development of practice that is shared effectively through the review process. And then, interestingly enough, one of the main ways in which reporting capacity has been built in developing countries has been through training reviewers and their experience of reviewing other people's reporting mechanisms. So that itself is very useful. What the Paris Agreement does specifically is that it requires, on the one hand, developing countries to develop a far more detailed approach to reporting than they did in the past, but it also provides a significant amount of both financial and technical resources to develop national systems to get to this point. So aside from reporting on greenhouse gases, we're also obliged to report on the implementation and achievement of our NDC. And our NDC is defined narrowly or broadly in any way we choose within a broad set of parameters. So there are potentially very big synergies between the type of data infrastructure we need to assemble to report internationally and the type of infrastructure that we need for national policy making. And this goes across the board from mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and all the way to what types of international support we need. One of the things we did at COP27 was to extend this whole review process on a voluntary basis to adaptation information, so that what we report on adaptation, both in terms of the projected impacts and also in terms of what interventions we need to make, is also reviewed by an international team of experts at our request. There are within the set of concentric circles, there's quite a lot of freedom in terms of what countries decide to, first, what they put into their NDCs, and our NDC has an enormous amount of emphasis on the just transition and on poverty and inequality. and the way we report on that, or the way we choose to report on that, requires us to provide a core set of information, but it also allows us to provide other information associated with this, including what kinds of international support we require, how much will this cost, et cetera, et cetera. And the support that comes with this, there are two kinds of support. The first support is that we get around about $600,000 per report. And each report will be over a 2-year period. So those, and that money can basically go into building national systems to do this. Then we also have access to a large fund to build capacity for reporting. And we currently, I think South Africa currently has a project which a multi-million rand project that the DFFE is implementing related to improving our data infrastructure. Then the extent to which we make this useful, I think, depends on how we understand the systems that go into that culminate in the reports. So, and one of the other strengths of the international system is that there is varying levels of guidance for different kinds of reporting. So there's very detailed guidance internationally on greenhouse gas reporting, which makes it comparable across different countries. There's less detailed guidance on reporting on NDCs and on support needs, and even less on adaptation. But that also gives us a certain leeway to establish practice. And this is one of the more influential processes in the multilateral reporting system, in that over the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of the practices that are currently in place that are not mandated by specific decisions, but are a result of how countries have interpreted relatively broad mandates. And then there's been, as I said, a strong degree of peer learning. And so we, in a sense, have the ability to build around that core set of data, build into that a number of the key indicators that we would like to report internationally, and build the systems that produce those key indicators, and then also look at what synergies are available from these indicators to other areas of national policy. Just to give an example on this, I mean, our understanding of the coal value chain is actually relatively bad in terms of the details, but this is one of our main emission sources, not only from a point of view of how much coal we use every year, but also in terms of how many people are employed, in what capacity, et cetera, et cetera. All of that data is extremely valuable to implement just transition related policies, but the database that we have for all that is quite weak. But this international reporting process basically gives us a platform to improve that, and also access to resources to improve that. There are strong links between this reporting and the kind of voluntary reporting that we do on sustainable development goals, but they haven't been made very strongly on a national basis. And this establishment of the reporting process now for Paris, which is due, the first report is due in 2024. At the end of 2024 is a really good opportunity to kind of survey the flow of information around climate change mitigation and adaptation, and the kind of indicators we're interested in across government, and look at ways in which these synergies and opportunities can be utilized. And the DFFE is, I think, they're going to talk about this in a moment, but they've just released a set of indicators for climate change, which cover a relatively broad set of climate change related policies, which are not necessarily related to the core objectives of climate policy, but they're related to all the other objectives that relate to that. Say, for instance, for things like public transport, etc., which are important for climate change, but also important for a number of other things. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you for helping me with the chairing, because this way it's perfect leeway into Samuel's intervention, because we'd love to hear from you on specifically these indicators and whether there are also some of them are relevant for inequality.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, well, in our space in South Africa, issues around inequality, they occupy center stage in our developmental agenda. Because our national development plan, Vision 2030, articulates that we need to address inequality, address issues around job creation, and as well as poverty, which is facing the country. And hence, all South African policies and strategies per se need to be sensitive to that national policy aspiration, development aspiration. In terms of the national climate change policy, which was adopted by government in 2011, well, the core messages arising from that policy mandate was for South Africa to develop what we call NEVA, National Employment Vulnerability Assessment. And I think in our case, that was a helpful directive. Why? Because it helped us to basically unpack inequality in our context, to formulate key attributes on inequality. This we did collaboratively with our stakeholders, because we interrogated them basically to come with a national consensus on some of the aspects, which is also inequality. And the outcome was we came up with, I think, essentially 4 attributes. One of them, that was the financial resources. People say that we need to have financial means to address inequality. The second one was the physical capital. This relates to, for example, infrastructure and housing, which need to be addressed. The third one was the human capital. This talked to the skill sets that people need to acquire to enable them to transition to lower carbon economy that we envision. And lastly, there was talk of on social capital, which talks to the social inclusivity of all layers of the South African community, as well as also enabling, enhancing the networking of communities to address climate change. So we actually worked on the study, which culminated into what we call the sector job resilience plan. That looked at the value chains, coal value chain, metal value chain, agricultural value chain, tourism value chain, some of them. And then this was just an attempt to understand, for example, how inequalities, can be addressed in those, value chains. This was, in fact, this approach is sort of like a bottom-down approach. But at the same time, the policy also actually mentioned that we need to design mitigation actions which can yield high in terms of co-benefits, if you like, or whatever non-greenhouse gas emission impacts. In that space, we are actually assessing mitigation impacts, looking at 2 dimensions, both the greenhouse gas impact assessment as well as the non-GG impact or co-benefits assessment. And there we collect data, of course, on those 2 dimensions. But currently, while we are rich in data sets that talk to greenhouse gases, because that we have regularized, we still have some gray areas in terms of collecting data on co-benefits. But of course, as a response to that, we are working extensively internally to identify gaps and constraints in data collection, which of course also talk to co-benefits part which are linked to inequality aspects. But also, not only that, we are looking at middle level, the middle point, let me say, where we assess policies in terms of understanding how they interact. For example, a mitigation action in the energy sector could be interacting with a mitigation with another strategy, like your development strategies. And then we tailor-made what we call the Sustainable Development Guideline, which is the ACEIR tool, but into a South African, tailored tool, and then in undertaking such an assessment. So once we have addressed those 2 or 3 layers, what we do, because the ultimate goal is actually reporting both domestically and internationally. Domestically, international, of course, that South Africa is a party. We have got, an obligation to report to the UNFCCC process. We do it every 4 years through national communication reports, 4 years. And then also concurrently, we have what we call the biennial update report, which is a 2-year reporting framework. But also, if you look at our current reports, there are some gaps per se, which talks to co-benefits, and our intention is to enrich that component so that we are able to report internationally as well. But domestically, we are institutionalizing what we call the National Climate Change Report. Before, it used to be a sympathetic report. That is to say, it was a science-based report. It means a report that provides update on the science of climate change in South Africa. But we realized that it does not transmit key messages for policy and decision-making processes. And as a result, starting this year, we tailor-made it to be, in the form of indicators. So hence, we are now, we have just, I think last week, very recent anyway, we have published the 4th one, which is called the 4th Climate Change Tracking Report. And if you look in that report, it looked at thematic areas. And some of them, they talk to inequality aspects. And some of the outcome, actually, they are quite helpful for decision-making. A typical one, for example, would be examining job losses in the energy sector. We developed an indicator that shows that job increases in the renewable energy sector, which is also an important indicator. So that report is widely distributed. But over and above that, in South Africa, we have what we call the National Climate Change Information System. The National Climate Change Information System is a system of systems. There's no one tool. There are different tools. It's keep on expanding. Some of them, they are like, we have got a green book. We have got the SDGC Atlas, Some of those indicators entail there, they talk to inequality aspects. So there's a rich, information in terms of data sets contained in that, in the National Climate Change Information System. However, of course, as I mentioned, there are certain gaps that we are trying to address. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was extremely interesting. And it's true that in our inequality diagnostics, so we have inequality of consumption, of income, of labor market, both in terms of access and returns on the labor market, in terms of the inequality of education, health, basic services. We always have a gender section because we see that all the different inequalities overlap when it comes to issues such as gender, and we do that at different spatial levels. So it would be interesting for us to think around, okay, but then what would a climate section look like? So maybe my question first for Werner would be, what would be the interesting indicator I would think around in the South African context? And then maybe for Andrew and Samuel, what would you be interested in seeing in such an inequality report? And if I may just add one question, because I was just thinking right now, both, I think, Andrew and yourself, Samuel, when you mentioned inequality and climate change, you mentioned jobs. But I think that what we see is that although the labor market is the main driver of inequalities here, inequality is much more than jobs. So for instance, when you mentioned the coal value chains, are there also projects that look at, for instance, what is the financial capital involved in the coal value chain and who actually owns this capital? So if you could also react on that. But maybe, Werner, you want to start with the future ITR?
Okay, thanks. Yes, so I think Anders spoke about all the different things we look at in the ITR, whether it be from consumption, income, assets, gender, employment, labor market. So I think the key underlying is to say, let's go back and look at what other frameworks we need to bring into the conversation. We already heard talk about the Paris, but then there's also all these other ones internally that we can look to sort of shape and help us formulate what these new chapters would be. Because I think we have to go back to the data itself. The data is the key. I think one of the core data sets that are contained within the Inequality Trends Report come from household expenditure surveys. South Africa runs 2 of them. We have the classic income and expenditure survey, but also a more poverty-focused living conditions survey. Now, funding has been a big challenge in government, and these surveys are very, very expensive to do. So we are now actually in the field conducting the new income and expenditure survey. And so that, when it's completed at the end of this year, the data collection will be completed in November of this year, would then give us sort of a new opportunity to revisit the Inequality Trends Report and update a lot of what we have done. But I think the challenge is that in terms of new indicators to bring in, we'll have to see how far the data can take us. I think one of the core strategies at StatsSA is about building data ecosystems so that we are parts, the IES or all the data that exists within these things is part of a larger ecosystem. So it's easier to bring these data sets in and to analyze and to draw connections. But I think if we have to think about sort of where to next with the ITR, I mean, I think climate change in itself is a fascinating area. I think you think about inequality, and now we're talking about inequality, and I have a very, we have all a different understandings. Same with poverty. You say, what's your definition of poverty? It's all different. What's your definition of inequality? It's all different. But I think what makes climate change so fascinating is that it is inherently unequal in that, the people who have polluted, who have caused or exacerbated the problem the most, where you would say the global north, the richer countries, and then those who are bearing the brunt of its impacts, the global south, developing countries. So there's already an inequality in terms of the problem itself, but then how that impacts us is also tremendous disparity. And I think one of the weaknesses of the ITR was its geographic depth. So we have national household surveys that generally can go down, national, provincial. You can do some metro level analysis because of the sample sizes there. But if you really want to drill deeper, district, municipal, ward, and I think that's really where you need to begin telling the story. So I think telling the story at that aggregate level really hinders or limits you. So it's about making sure so we can say, how do we get that geographic depth into the data set so that we can look at it? I mean, obviously, we've got a new census that was conducted in 2022, and results will be released this year that we can turn to. So I think that's the first challenge, is how do we bring more depth to the ITR? In addition, and tangential to that is the GSI side of it, because I think when we think about climate change, we have to think about how areas are different, right? Some areas are more flood prone, some are more have water limitations or water risks, more arid. So there's all these different dimensions where you've got extreme heats if you're in the desert areas, and all these things manifest differently. And what we need is to really build a sort of GIS representations that you can overlay onto these statistics that we produce in the ITR, that then you can begin being able to disaggregate for those distinctions. Because right now you could, if you just say, okay, we're worried about the energy. I think energy is an easy one. We're just concerned about energy and access, and we can map access to energy, and we can see disparities and where people have more access, where they've got less access. But I don't think it tells you necessarily how the climate change is actually going to impact or hurt those areas just based off of the access itself. There's other underlying factors that you need to understand. And I think that's bringing that GIS in, and I think that's something that can be constructed outside of the ITR that you can just import in and then say, you know, this is a map, and then we are able to distinguish here and there what we can do. And I think then lastly would just be trying to see with the existing data, because I think long term we have to say, what are the new indicators we need to collect data on? Because, you know, there's a lag time between when we come here and we discuss and we say this is something we need to do. To be able to get that into a data collection instrument, to take it to the field, to collect and to bring back takes quite an amount of time. So we have this beautiful discussion now, but we can only really give it meat to the bone in 5 years' time when all this data is available. So now we need to say, what for the data that we have now, what proxies can we derive or develop that could serve as substitutes as we build into these new frameworks?
Thank you so much. I know, Simon, do you want to come in, or Andrew? We need to wrap up by 12:10 the latest. So if you want to get some questions, we need to be brief. Andrew, or
yeah, there we go. Just briefly as a to follow on from those two excellent inputs. We are so to a certain extent we're coming up against the limits of the current data infrastructure that we have, and some of this was put in place with a great deal of effort following the end of apartheid, like for instance information on what type of energy sources households are using, but we're getting to a point where there is a mismatch between the type of policies we're trying to implement around climate change and climate change mitigation, and particularly around integrating climate change mitigation with other policy areas and taking advantage of some of the co-benefits that come through that. And so in a way, we need to actually reassess the data structure that we have now and identify the gaps. And the point that was just made about the length of time this takes is incredibly important, that this is something that needs to be done now, so that in 5 or 6 years' time, we actually have we start getting the kind of data that we would need. And there are a number of complicated connections between mitigation and adaptation, for instance, in relation to households and what the impact on things like air conditioning will be. So interestingly enough, in Mexico at the moment, the key expense that poor households spend money on first is actually air conditioning, in informal settlements as well. So, and as the climate starts to, as we get more extreme heat in summer, et cetera, there will be what households need in terms of essential services will also change considerably. We have relatively good data on the supply side in terms of things like electricity, but we have very bad data on the demand side, and that's a result of having a number of hypothetical policies in place post 1994, but these were never really implemented. And the demand side data that we need all the way from households up to industries is really critical to having an integrated climate response. And so in a sense, it may be useful to do a kind of mapping exercise and look at where all the gaps are and what the kind of long-term processes we need to be putting in place for those are. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, well, from my side, I think some of the key aspects, perhaps that also warrants attention. It's examining issues around inequality, both ex post as well as ex ante. I'm saying this because currently most of the focus is, for example, assessing actions ex post. But for policy making, it is important that we are also forward-looking in terms of understanding, future impacts of mitigation actions on inequality aspects. And that is also as we talk to, for example, the Low Emission Development Strategy 2050. We know the end point, actually, that we want to reach net zero by 2050. But what we don't know is the social transformation aspects, some of them talking to inequality, that will be needing to unpack, as we cascade down to 2050. And also this talks to the climate finance mechanism that will also mesh, the envisaged transition. So those are some of the aspects that we need to look at. And also, I think, because currently the challenge we have is that of the, looking at the multi-layered governance framework. When you look at the national government, we have a provincial government, and we have got as well a local government. And all those, finance governance layers, they talk of addressing inequality. But that is not done harmoniously. Else, I think the issues we need to perhaps entrench issues around inequality in the multi-layer governance frameworks, and I think that will be helpful in that space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, yeah, it's working. I like your point about that we know the endpoint for emissions, and it's true that when it comes to inequality, we don't know that endpoint. It's not like poverty where we can say we want to eradicate extreme poverty. It's very difficult to agree as a society on what is the desired or tolerated level of inequality, and I don't know, maybe Mike can come on that. But shall we take some questions if there? I don't know if in the virtual space there are questions. No? Okay, so let's take them here. I don't know how this works. I can just roam around with this. I'll start here because it's closer. Sorry, I'm going to come that way after.
Hi, Hi, I'm Louise from WWF. I have a suggestion, I have a question, and I have information, 3 things. So the suggestion is that Werner, if I may use first names, the GIS data, that the overlay that you're looking for might exist in the Green Book that Samuel spoke about, which is the most granular detail I know about, that projects climate impacts and what can be done about them. It's like, yeah, very granular, geographically granular. Then the information is, we always talk about this issue of geopolitical inequality between who's caused the problem and who is suffering the worst impacts. But my colleague James Reeler looked at common but differentiated responsibility domestically. And of course, it reveals, the obvious, that within the country, who is responsible for the greatest level of emissions is the richer among us. So I think that that's an aspect that one also has to think about and address. And then my question is, I was asked by, in relation to the Just Energy Transition Partnership, I was asked by among the international partner countries, you know, how do they fund the justice in the JETP? And I was asked to develop some sort of framework for what would be a just energy transition project that could be funded. And I couldn't determine what the indicators for, so obviously I put in, you know, it must have either mitigation and or adaptation impact. And I couldn't find what would be the indicators of adaptation impact. So I'm quite interested in that. Thank you.
Oh, I don't know who that country was, but I know that we as France have also asked for that. And I think that ACF is doing some work on that. We can follow up on that discussion. So questions on this side. We're going to go this way.
Hello, I'm Michelle. I'm at UCT. So I'm wondering questions about the limitations of data, indicators, and reporting in this way that you've presented. And I'm also wondering about aspects of values, because never in a world organized by the capitalist world ecology have people been asked how they want to live. And in my own research with the Tsitsikamma and Mpenga community that were very self-sufficient, at least food self-sufficient, until they were removed off their land in 1977. They say now everything needs money. And so now all this reporting is very reductionist and very indicator driven without really looking at more broader value bases of how people would like to live.
Thank you. Here, I think one very brief question.
Okay, my name is Michael Velila from the Movement for Change and Social Justice. My question is a very simple one, because the budget was passed on the 22nd. When I look at the budget, when it was passed, and I look at the inequality, and there was a midterm budget that was passed last year. For 3 years, the budget was cut with 88 billion rands for 3 years. Now, I think, how would you deal with the challenge of inequality? Because it will not happen, because if that budget is cut with 88 billion rands, and the returns that the richest have get from the budget that was now on the 22nd, 15 billion rand was given to the rich people, not attending to the poor people. Because you look at that people, the number of people who are on social grants, you got plus minus 18 million people. You got people on social relief of distress, you got plus minus 12 million people. So you got half of the country are not working, are dependent on government. How will you address inequality?
Thank you. No, I can't be brief, sorry. What I would love to see on the Inequalities Trends report, in its current formats and phrasing, it's based on my, I would say my humble opinion is quite based on scientific and some economic rationalism and scientific reductionism. And it kind of excludes a lot of knowledge systems that can be integrated. So we ought to be asking what informs it, what knowledge systems informs it. That's number one. But number two, what I want to pose to Prof. Murray is that from the Inequalities Trends report, what is quite apparent is that the inequality in this country is actually entrenched in the labor markets, over 70% of it, right? So we often talk in these spaces about the deployment of transitional finance or climate finance, if you like. So that being deployed to the real economy simply means you are propagating basically social technical transition, whether in the energy space, in energy or agro-food systems in a country where we are a net food importer, but we are dealing with over 50% hunger in our country, whether we deploy it in ICT and general purpose infrastructure in the urban context, whereas the majority are relegated into the peripheries of the urban setting. So even if it deployed that transitional finance in urban infrastructure, it doesn't benefit the people. In food system, it doesn't benefit. In energy systems, it doesn't benefit the people, whether you're putting renewables and so on. Because if you are saying that you deploy it in the real economy to create jobs, it begs the question, what kind of jobs within the South African context is the context that is in that report, Inequalities Trends report, where inequalities are in the labor market. So when we talk about deploying transitional finance or climate finance, when you like to propagate this social technical transition, what we ought to be having at the back of our minds, what change do we like to see? And within the South African context, putting my neck in the block, it doesn't matter within the context of the broader social, societal inequalities, because at any given point, you're exacerbating them or increasing poverty, if you like. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, I can't.
Thank you. I'm Julia Taylor from Wits University, and I had a question about this idea you raised that, you know, a just transition isn't only about jobs and what else can we think about. And in line with also considering gender inequalities, often climate impacts lead to a greater burden on the unpaid work in the household. And that is measured often only, I mean, one of the measures is time use surveys. So how can we think about incorporating time use surveys and understanding what people are spending time on? Are they spending more time on water collection because of drought? You know, those kinds of things I think would be really useful, but unfortunately our time use surveys haven't been updated.
Thank you so much. And we have one hand up virtually that I was allowed to give space to. So Dave, pardon.
Hi, it's David Gordon, University of Bristol. We can guesstimate the impacts of climate change on different groups using scientific and normative criteria. But the impacts of, say, excessive heat or floods or storms differentially impact people depending on their context. So heat differentially impacts older people and young babies, for example. But of course, even within a household, the impact can be very different depending on people's personal circumstances and their assets and the way they live. So is it possible for Statistics South Africa to develop a kind of module where you actually ask people what the impacts of different aspects of climate change have had on their lives? That way we could then adjust our normative measures so that they were based on real data rather than just on purely scientific studies, which may or may not be applicable in the context we're applying them to, because it's very rarely you take a study from different parts of the world and then apply it to different parts of South Africa in order to get an aggregate estimate.
Thank you so much. So we each have maximum 2 minutes. We're going to just start in this direction and end with Murray.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, I'll just perhaps touch on some of the aspects that we can respond to from our space. In terms of the ZIP, I think the question was raised on how the just transition could be monitored here. I think what perhaps I need to update this forum on is currently I'm in the group on just transition, M&E, development. There's a working group on the development. We are developing a just transition, M&E for the just transition. So we are going to come up with specific indicators on just transition, and I should suspect some of those indicators they will be talking to issues around inequality or related to inequality one way or the other. And then On the question of how we can address inequality, also take into account, the people who are impacted most, especially communities who reside in rural or semi-rural areas. Well, because by default, the South Africa's climate action per se is designed in a manner that should ideally be addressing, key issues that affect the communities. This is so. For example, when you look at some of the programs like the Working for Water program, which actually are tailored to meet the needs of the vulnerable groups. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the sector job resilience plans are actually intended to address exactly that, as you mentioned. And then I think there was also talk on the deployment of the transitional finance, how that can be done perhaps more proactively. Well, I think this is talking to the Just Transition Framework document that the Cabinet just approved, which I think that document will guide the investment plan. Hence, that issue will be addressed there. No, thank you very much.
Okay, I don't think I'm going to take them point by point, so I'm going to.
No, you can just select something that allows you to keep in 2 minutes.
So I think thanks, Louise, for the Green Book suggestion about the potentially being that GIS layer. I think a couple of the points, Michelle, and then also I think Professor Gordon, about sort of how bringing a subjective element into the discussion, right? I think one of the things we did in the living conditions survey, which was a survey designed to be more poverty specific, is we did have a section which was based on socially perceived necessities. So this was so this section essentially was built off of another survey that had been done where they engaged with respondents to identify what are the most important necessities to them, sort of self-defined as priorities. And then we take that as a list and then measure it objectively within the LCS. And I think that type of approach is also something we need to consider replicating from an inequality perspective of saying, let us identify the different issues about, how do people define it? How do they see climate impacting them? And what are their remedies for dealing with it, or their particular challenges, and then measuring that against it. So I think that is one way we could potentially begin looking at that subjective element and bringing the voice. I think Professor Harrison, right at the beginning of the day, one of her points was about giving a voice to all. And I think that feeds into it. Then I think there's a last point. I think Michael was talking about budget cuts. How do we handle the budget cuts? And I mean, this is a big problem. I mean, it's not just the last 3 years. We've been dealing with budget cuts since 2010. And this has had a big impact. And I think it's dual. So I'll say, obviously, the impact that you're talking about is how can we cut money, but then still help people who are struggling, and more, they're struggling more and more. But I think let's take it from an internal angle, and I'll bring in then Julia's point about the time use survey, is that when budgets are cut, it doesn't just impact on the implementation side and the program side. It also impacts on the collection side of where we build up this knowledge and information that we ultimately use, right? So we fought for 7 years with Treasury just to get a new income and expenditure survey. The last time we had data was 2015. So, I mean, that has created a tremendous gap that exists. Same with time use. Time use is another very critical survey. And it's simply on the bottom of the chopping block when it comes to, we need money for this, we need money for that, we need money for this, and it falls at the bottom. But internally, we can say that it is something that we constantly are talking about. How do we bring it back? How do we integrate it? And I think one of the things we're trying to do is to streamline our data collection processes at Stats through better vehicles that would allow us not only to get more depth, but so that we can maintain what we're doing right now, but have sample designs in a way that you can then just collect sort of a subsample of information on, say, time use, but able then to extrapolate it into the other areas.
Thanks. I just wanted to make one comment about the just transition. I'm very glad to hear that the department is developing some indicators around how exactly we are going to make progress on that. And this is, I think, a very useful cross-cutting example to try to unpack that a little bit. Not all of these indicators need to be quantitative. I think there are ways of building qualitative information into this, and some quite valuable information can come out of this. In the 90s, when the unit that I work in at ECT was doing a lot of work on household energy, we did a very large project called the Social Determinants of Energy Use, which basically unpacked exactly how people thought about energy and how they made choices. And that kind of work is extremely valuable in understanding what the quantitative indicators are telling you about this. Thanks.
Thank you. A few quick points, and they're all about the value of this particular engagement and what we're doing. And one was what struck me so much about when Andrew was talking and others were talking about the info that's available on climate change and is in the Green Book and is in whatever, and then the SDG reporting. And these processes are effectively not very well linked at all. And the way the SDG reporting happens in South Africa is quite siloed. And there's an easy win there around consolidation. That just is a question of commitment. So that's a margin we can push on. Where there's harder work to be done is this issue of geographic depth. It's come up as so important today. And it's also important in the question that you asked about the unevenness of the impacts, and the way finance works keeps replicating the existing structures of inequalities. Well, we need overlaid, detailed, disaggregated, local area level information. The problem with the information being in the Green Book is that it needs to be merged with the socioeconomic information and triangulated. That's the whole ball game, really. So that's the hard exercise that needs to be done. And it's absolutely crucial. It's come up any number of times today that the actual impacts of many of these financing options or even policy implementation is at the local level. And so we need that information. And then I just want to end by saying that the questions, this is not an endorsement of the status quo. There's still the responsibilities of us as researchers, as NGOs, as civil society, to actually do the hard analysis, and the analysis about the intra-household distribution and who bears the brunt of many of these things within our country. You know, whether it's you take away a social grant or you implement a particular climate change financing mechanism, you need to understand how the vulnerabilities work in the country. And that's, I'm not taking away the role of researchers. We've got an absolutely crucial role to play, because the policy discussion in the country does tend to look at this data as a cross-section and see and argue that it speaks for itself. Even very good granular local level data doesn't speak for itself. It you know, thanks.
Thank you so much. And we're going to stop here. And a big thank you to all of you for the questions and to the panelists. Thank you.